An important component of ethical practice is the process by which we make decisions about ethical issues. So this session is going to talk about ethical decision making. And by the end of the session, we hope you'll develop criteria and a process for ethical decision making and apply ethical principles to typical human services situations. So first, go back by reviewing ethical dilemmas. What is an ethical dilemma? So ethical dilemma is when a human service professional must choose between two or more relevant but contradictory ethical directives. That might be between two goods that a client might receive or two benefits or the avoidance of two harms. So it could be a dilemma where every alternative results in an undesirable outcome and you have to choose between the lesser of the evils. It can also be defined as a situation where professional duties and obligations, which are rooted in both personal and professional core values, clash. And this is when you as a professional need to decide which values should take precedence in the situation. And we use an ethical decision-making process in order to make that happen. So let's review what some of the areas of ethical conflict are in human services. So we often have ethical dilemmas in relation to our direct service to clients. And these can center on many different issues which we're going to talk about throughout this quarter. Confidentiality issues, boundary issues, issues related to dual relationships with clients, issues around informed consent. There's many different ethical issues that we can have in our work with individual clients. And then kind of in the macro area of practice, including social policy, community planning or advocacy, research and evaluation, or social welfare. There can be conflicts of interest, there can be inappropriate use of influence, there can be issues around talking to the media. There's a lot of different issues that come up in this macro level of practice. And then there's kind of the issues that happen within our agencies where we work. Issues with our colleagues, with our supervisors, with the directors of the organization. We might discover that one of our colleagues is practicing incompetently. We can also look at conflicts of interest within our own agencies, boundary issues between employees and supervisors, problems with fundraising or inappropriately or not marketing ourselves correctly. There can be whistleblowing within the agency. So there's a lot of ethical issues that come up just within our own agencies. So these are some of the sources of ethical dilemmas. When one or more, or I should say two or more professional standards conflict with each other, when the professional standards are in conflict with the demands of our institutions. That could be the institution where we work or another institution, the legal institution, child welfare system, etc. When we have conflicting loyalties, maybe to our families and to our clients, or to our agency and to our clients, or to two different clients, when a good solution does not seem attainable, so that what I was talking about earlier, the like having to choose the lesser of two evils and not feeling very good about it. Or when a professional finds it difficult to adhere to an ethical standard, maybe something that you don't agree with in relationship to working with a client. So how do we resolve these ethical dilemmas? As we've been talking about, we have many different tools to help us work through ethical issues. And one very important tool is to have an ethical decision-making process. Um, what is our ethical responsibility as practitioners? We need to practice in a manner that's legal and ethical. We need to consider whether an intervention we've chosen with a client has unintended harmful consequences. We need a decision-making process that weighs values and obligations and considers the consequences of actions and then tries to select the best course of action for a client. So this process should protect the rights of all involved and ensure that professional duties and responsibilities are addressed. It requires awareness on our part of our own values and morals, and that's something that we've been working on in this class to become more aware of our values. And then an awareness of the profession's ethics and standards, and that's one of the reasons we're looking at the professional ethics codes. It requires some knowledge of the law related to your area of practice, and it requires getting consultation from colleagues. And in many ethical dilemmas, there isn't just one right answer, but hopefully there is a best or better decision or answer. And using an ethical decision-making process takes practice, and we want to make sure that this practice will become a habit. So this is one ethical decision-making model. There's a similar one in your Howard and Korver book. So that starts with describing the problem or the ethical dilemma. Who's involved? What are they dealing with? Whose issue is it? Why is it a problem? And sometimes that isn't always clear exactly what the problem is or whose problem it is. Then you want to identify the issues and conflicts involved and clearly articulate it. Is it an ethical issue, a legal issue, a personal issue, a clinical issue, or some combination? Is the conflict internal? So is it within yourself, or is it external? A conflict within the agency or between the client and another system? And then you want to identify the relevant ethics, laws, and your own values that come into play in the situation. You need to consult widely with your supervisor, sometimes with an attorney, with colleagues, with other experts. And although these steps are presented linearly, you'll often go back and forth between steps 1 to 6 in order to get a clear picture of the dilemma. And then once you have gotten as much information as you can, you will generate, examine, and evaluate action alternatives. And also, in doing that, look at what the consequences of each course of action might be. Once you've selected the course of action and implemented it, then you want to evaluate the outcome of the action. How was it effective? What did you learn? Were the results as you expected, or were there unexpected results? Do you still think it was the best decision? And what are some implications for future ethical decision making? What have you learned that you will apply to future situations? So there are some other things to consider when you're in the process of ethical decision making. And this is similar to an ethical principle screen or a testing process like the one in our text. The main message is you need a system for deciding on the best course of action in an ethical dilemma. So the highest obligation is to protect human life, but how you define that can also be a dilemma. Not just life itself, but the quality of life needs to be considered. And then you want to think people should be treated equally, but should particular care be taken based on unequal status as well, if someone is a child or disabled or in a minority population. People have the right to make their own decisions. We definitely have the value of autonomy and empowerment in the human services profession. But what if they're making a decision that is harmful to themselves or others? And then the publicity or transparency test, which is similar to the front page test in our text. Could you justify or explain your action to the public and it be acceptable? And then there's the justice test, which is similar to the other sure loved one test. Does the action treat people fairly? Would you do the same thing if the client were rich, famous, influential? Would you do the same thing if the client was your loved one? Or if the shoe was on the other foot and you were in the client's situation? And then what will cause the least possible harm? And then we can also consider the tests in our text, the role model test and the mother test as well. So these are some questions to ask in the ethical decision-making process. We'll go over each one of them individually. Who can be of help? What are my choices? When have I made similar decisions in the past? Where do principles, standards, laws, and policies lead me? Why am I choosing the option choosing? And how will I carry it out? So who can be of help? We've talked about our supervisor is a very important source of help, maybe other people in the organization, the director, the board of directors. Certainly our colleagues are people we're going to want to talk to. Specialists related to whatever the issue is. Sometimes we need to seek legal counsel. And the help that we can get are to generate more options, to evaluate our options, to help plan out how we're going to implement whatever action we decide on. And if we need to practice some kind of role play, we can consult with people. And when we want to debrief the decision. So we can consult and get help both before and after the process, and in the middle of it too. And what are my choices? This is where we're generating alternatives, brainstorming all the possibilities. And one of the choices might be to do nothing. You want to list the pros and cons, and the pros and cons for whom, and how the timing of what you do might make a difference, and how your choices might fit in with both core principles and those ethical tests we talked about. You want to look back at past ethical dilemmas that you've been involved in. When have you made a similar decision? Was what you did effective? And if not, why not? How is this particular situation different from that one? And from those past decisions, did you come up with your own personal policy that you can apply to this situation? Where do the principles, standards, laws, and policies lead me? All these things you might take into account as you're making a decision. Professional code of ethics, licensing laws, agency regulations, contractual obligations. All these things will come into play as you're making a decision. Maybe not all of them in every decision, but certainly you'll want to think about whether any of these apply. And then you want to, when you come to where you're getting ready to make a decision, or you've chosen an option, you want to examine your motives for choosing it. Not just because it's the easiest thing to do. What are your motives for choosing this option? You need to have a good self-awareness. And don't do the right thing for the wrong reason. And these are some of the wrong reasons. Self-interest being one. Countertransference with a client is another possibility. And are you doing something because you want to get positive publicity or avoid negative publicity? You need to examine those reasons as well. And how will you carry out your decision? The process does matter. The ends do not necessarily justify the means. You want to consider what your ultimate objective is, and usually that is, for the welfare of the client. And you need to use your skills in understanding human behavior and strategy and empathy and communication and your cultural competency when you're deciding how you're going to carry out the decision you've made. So we've talked a lot about the process. Let's put it into practice. Let's look at a case. So we have a client, a relatively new client in your intensive outpatient chemical dependency program, Rolanda, and she wants to look through her record and see what has been written about her. In the file, there are notes from interviews with Rolanda's parents who reported that Rolanda was adopted, but they had never told her that she had been adopted. There's also a file from a psychiatric evaluation from a former treatment program that she attended. And the person who did the evaluation wrote a long list of mental health diagnoses, and then also noted that they did not think Rolanda had a very good prognosis for recovery. So, what are you going to do here? Let's go through the whole ethical decision-making process related to this case. First of all, let's describe the problem or dilemma. We're looking at the client's rights versus the potential harm to the client and to her parents. We're looking at the confidentiality rights of the parents. And we're also wanting to consider, will what we do cause harm to the client's treatment? Will it cause harm to our relationship with the client or make her want to leave treatment or not feel like treatment can help her. So we want to identify the issues and the conflicts involved. Should the client have full access to clinical records? Under what conditions should clients' access to records do harm? Whose interests in addition to the client should be taken into consideration? And we want to consider the issues of client autonomy versus paternalism. But by paternalism, I mean that the agency is acting in a paternalistic manner. It's taking the decision away from the client. So you want to figure out what the underlying issues are, so that you can ask the right question. So the next step is to consider the relevant ethical guidelines. And in this case, we're going to look at the guidelines of the chemical dependency profession. And there's a lot of guidelines that might apply to this case. There's a standard related to client welfare, related to client self-determination, and related to preventing harm. And these are somewhat general standards. They don't say anything specific about this case, but they're good ones to keep in mind. And then as we look more closely around standards that are relevant to this case, there's the release of assessment results. So we need to consider the welfare of the person who's being assessed when releasing the results. And the information shared should include accurate and appropriate interpretations when the assessment results are to or from another entity. There's the confidentiality, privileged communication, and privacy standard, which allows for confidentiality of client information. And then there's professional responsibility, that your responsibility to the client and your effectiveness with the client is based on their ability to trust you. So these are things we need to keep in mind as you're making the decision. There's also laws and regulations, and in this case, HIPAA, which I have spelled incorrectly, it should be one P and two A's, applies, as do your own values of client self-determination and do no harm, and whatever else your particular values might be. I just put a couple of mine here. So let's take a look at HIPAA, which I've spelled wrong on this slide as well. So the right to for clients to have access to their records is part of HIPAA, but it isn't an unequivocal right. There are times when patients can be denied access to their medical records. It says here that patients do not have the right to access their own psychotherapy notes necessarily, and that if there are records that might be subject to the Privacy Act, like perhaps what the client's parents have said might be subject to their own confidentiality rights. And if the information was obtained from someone other than the healthcare provider, for example, the psychiatrist at the previous institution, that might also be protected. So we really need to sort through the HIPAA rights as well. So once you have sifted through all that, you also want to obtain consultation from others. You're certainly going to talk to your supervisor and your colleague, and you probably will want to get some legal advice if your agency has an attorney. The agency is considered a covered entity under HIPAA, and all agree when you are consulting with them that there is both a legal and ethical obligation to share information from the client, from the file with the client. How much and how to do it are more of the question, not whether you should do it or not. So now you are going to generate alternatives. You're going to brainstorm different courses of action. So you could make copies of the entire file and give that to Rolanda and just let her take a look at it. The possible consequences for that are that she will learn harmful information without really understanding any context, that her parents' privacy will be violated, that it's possible that it will ruin her relationship with her parents. You could make just copies of select parts of the file and give it to her to look at. And this way, the client will learn some useful but hopefully not harmful information, but still without any explanation or context of the information. You could explore more deeply with the client what she wants to know and why. This will help you with continue to build rapport and trust with the client. And in exploring this with the client might also help you determine what the right course of action is. It could maybe backfire. She might get hostile that you're just not letting her see the file and may feel suspicious about why you keep asking her about why she wants to know. You could sit with the client and review select information on the file with her. This could contribute to the therapeutic relationship and also help the client achieve her goals, especially if she has a good picture of the information provided. You could contact the client's parents and suggest they talk to their daughter about the adoption. There's many questions in this course of action. Did the parents tell you this information directly? Did you just find it in the file because they told it to someone else at a previous agency? And what is really the scope or mandate you have to do this? So these aren't all the alternatives and consequences, but they are, we're not going to go through the full process here, but they are, so it gives you an idea of the process you're going to go through. So you have now generated all those alternatives and you're ready to make a decision. So here's the course of action you have decided to implement. I'm going to talk with Rolanda and I'm going to explore more deeply what she wants to know and why. And then I'm going to sit with her and review the information in her file that is based only on the information I have gathered at my agency and what I know to be true. I'm not going to talk to her about previous agency's records or the psychiatrist's records or the interview with her family. I'm just going to talk to her about my assessment about her and what other people at my agency have been saying, like in the group she attends, etc. I'm going to provide context and explain diagnosis and impressions and explain the treatment options based on that. I think this experience will help to build a strong relationship with her and help her to set and achieve goals. And I'm going to offer her hope about her prognosis. And then once you have completed the course of action, you want to evaluate the outcome. Does the client continue to ask about her file? Is she more engaged in treatment? Is she achieving her treatment goals? You can't necessarily attribute those last two to just this intervention or this experience, but you can certainly know that if you didn't do this, some of these things might not have been achieved. So then we want to use the test. We want to test the choice with all those different tests we've talked about. We want to protect the client's welfare, and we think that our course of action is doing that. I think this would be applicable to others in similar situations. I think I would approve of it if one of my colleagues did the same. And I think this does honor the autonomy of the client and it empowers her with information, but it balances that autonomy with causing the least possible harm. I would not feel that I have to justify my action to the public. I think it would be acceptable. And I think it treats people fairly, that I think I would do the same thing no matter who the client was. And I also think my mother would approve. So we've looked at the ethical decision-making process, and these are just some key points to be aware of. Just know that even using an ethical framework, it is not possible to, or desirable, to be totally neutral with respect to your own values. Your values are what makes you the helping professional that you are. But using a process and bringing in all the other input into the process, the standards, the codes of ethics, your colleagues and supervisors' opinion, your client's opinion, that will help you make a good decision.